to communicate with someone, if you want to get across a point. People think very differently than Westerners do. We tend to be linear, where we think in a straight line. We tend to think, we have you write papers that reinforce this, where when you write the paper, that's a bad chair.
This one?
Okay, this is fine. So, I don't like sitting behind that big old desk. It's a small little class.
I know.
So, linear, we tend to think when we write papers, in that opening paragraph, what do you want to have at the end of that first paragraph? Well, topic sentence. We want to have a thesis statement, right? And so we want to let the reader know, you get their attention, and you get right to the point. We're very direct in our communication. And we reinforce that in our academic setting, etc. So, thesis statement, you're going to tell the reader exactly what you're going to tell them the rest of the paper. And then every time you start a new paragraph, you have a topic sentence. You're telling the reader what you're going to say in that paragraph. Then you flesh it out, you wrap it up in the last sentence, and then you move on to the next paragraph. So we are very, very linear. 1, 2, 3, I tell you what I want to tell you, and then I retell you what I said I was going to tell you. Okay, so we're incredibly direct, but there's a lot of cultures where directness is the opposite of what you want to do. You want to save face, you don't want to be direct, and so one type of thinking in other cultures is spiral thinking, or spiral logic, where that's how the topic is approached. You start way out in the periphery, you talk all the way around the topic, but you don't get to the main point. You sort of circle it. You get a little bit closer, but you don't. Sometimes, some cultures, you end up at the main point. Sometimes you just get very close to the main point, but you don't actually state it. Japanese culture tends to be that way. In Japan, the speaker does not tell the listener the specific point that they want to convey. Instead, they circle the topic, and it's a high context culture. You have to figure it out from the context. So, which to me, that seems kind of baffling. You're not going to ever really communicate directly what you want to say. You have to listen to the cues. But see, if you're in that culture, you're used to that, and so you get it. You can unlock the puzzle because you know all the cues. You know what's really being communicated because you're part of that culture, part of that context to give understanding. Sub-Saharan Africa tends to be like a daisy. So you got the main point, and so the speaker might start with the main point, but then they'll branch off into this area, and they'll go off in this sort of tangent, then they come back to the main point, then they go back to another external area, flesh that all out, and they come back to the main point, then they go back out, talk about something, but they bring it back to the main point, and so that's how they end up communicating. Of course, we are A, B, C. So that makes communication quite an interesting challenge when you're in different cultures to communicate, learn how to communicate effectively, and to not misunderstand the way people are trying to communicate with you. There's another cultural, so that's kind of logic and styles of communication. Another is this idea of status. There's achieved status and ascribed status. Achieved status, that is status that you earn by, your work, doing a good job, So you have worked your way up the ladder and you now have gotten into this particular position because of your skills, your knowledge, etc. That's achieved. But ascribed status is status that comes from your birth, things that you don't do to earn it. And that in certain cultures is of a higher value than ascribed status, achieved status. And so cultures that vary in this, like when you go to some cultures, the business card is really important because when they give you the business card, that becomes the clue for you to know what level of status this person has. So you look at the card, it's given early in some cultures. Give you the business card. In fact, in China, you take your business card with both hands and you hand it to each other. It becomes this kind of formality. It always struck me as so silly, because we're about, we want to kind of, we're low power distance cultures, so we want to even these things out. This kind of status thing. And so what happens is you take that business card and you put it in front of you. That's a sign of respect. You study it. And now you know what level the person you're communicating with is on so that you can communicate appropriately with the appropriate respect for that particular level. You got certain languages that have different, you have formal and informal language. And so they have a whole set of ways to use words based on whether this is an informal or a formal relationship. We have that a little bit in our culture, but not to the level that you have in many cultures. And so as far as ascribed and achieved status, that plays out sometimes. The status thing where if someone comes from, someone sends someone from their company to Beijing to meet with someone there in their, say they have a joint venture, and they go there and they are going to meet, and you send your technical expert, but he's mid-level in the corporation, to meet with the person who's the president of the joint venture there. That person may be very offended that you sent this person because they're not on the same level. Yes, they have the expertise in this area more than the president would have, but it's not about the expertise. It's about being on the same level to show the appropriate respect for the person you're going to meet. And so that may bring offense to send someone who is the expert, but they're not at the right level in the hierarchical chain. So status is a big deal in different cultures. And in some cultures, it's the ascribed status that's more important than the achieved status. We're very much achieved status culture. You have the opportunity. There are no limits on you. You can become anything you want to be. And then if you work hard, then you can earn that particular place. That's not always true in other countries and other cultures where it's, do you have, what is the Chinese phrase? I forget what the phrase was, but it basically means, do you have an important father? That's a big deal if you have an important father. Because that's an aspired status of value. Okay, so that's just a little bit about some other cultural differences. You may come across that as you're researching for your particular country. All right, back to the desk. I want to talk about, there's 3 chapters, chapters 6 through 8 in Craft, where he talks about God and culture. God through culture is one way to let's turn to 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 22. We know this passage, but let's review it. This is one of the most important missiological passages in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 22. I do not have the official version of the theology department in my hand. I left that in my office. I have a version that Kraft would be very proud of. This is a dynamic equivalent translation. So, New Living. All right, who will read 19 to 22? You guys are expecting me to read the Bible for you? I got to get out behind this desk. Got to get like in the circle with you guys.
You do.
Yes, 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 22. But actually, you know what? Let's read all the way to the end, to 27.
Verse 19. For though I am free, this is a New American Standard. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things, but then they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim, I box in such a way as not being there. I box in such a way as not being there. But I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified.
Okay, so let's talk about this passage. What is this talking about missiologically?
Doing whatever it takes to get the gospel.
And yeah, doing whatever it takes to get the gospel to people, but specifically, what is it saying it takes?
To be all things.
Yes, be all things, but what does that mean?
To relate to people in their way.
Cultural understanding?
To be
Okay.
able to kind of like form into every culture, almost to kind of adopt every culture as your own in a way.
Yes, to communicate the way that culture communicates. To win the Jew, he becomes a Jew. So he acts like a Jew, he tries to think like a Jew, he communicates in Jewish thought patterns. To reach a Gentile, he does the same. He becomes like a Gentile. He acts more like a Gentile, he thinks more like a Gentile, and behaves more like a Gentile. All right? So, it also tells us, perhaps it gives us insight into God's attitude toward culture. What does this say about what God thinks about culture? Daniel, what do you think? This passage, what do you think it implies about God's attitude toward culture?
This is a cheesy answer to begin with, but I think it's important to me. I think even in, this is coming from Paul's perspective of you can't bring, like we talked about already, you can't bring what our own cultural ideas and how we present has to be different because it's a different culture. I'm not making any sense. I'm sorry.
No, that's making sense.
There's something more. Probably there's a better answer than just like because we're all made differently, and almost a reflection of God if we present His gospel in a way that's relatable to them. I feel that's what the Lord would want, because He's very personal with us. He doesn't reveal the same. He doesn't reveal the same thing, but He presents Himself differently to all people. And I feel like we have an opportunity to do that when we present His gospel to different cultures and different nations. I feel like it's like a reflection of Him toward us.
God chooses to work to make Himself known in each culture according to their cultural understanding and paradigm. And so Paul is reflecting God in that when he becomes cross-cultural, becomes incarnational, is a word we like to use, because that's the ultimate illustration of God speaking in the language of a culture. When Jesus comes on the earth, He didn't speak English. Jesus spoke the language of the day. And so the people could understand Him. He didn't celebrate Christmas with a Christmas tree. Of course, Christmas wasn't a celebration at that time yet because it's based around His birth. But he celebrated the Jewish feasts and customs. He was Jewish. He took on the Jewish culture. And He then would unpack those cultural festivals to point toward God. So Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, we find Jesus in Jerusalem for the Festival of Lights in the book of John. And at the end of that festival, He says He's the light of the world. So He's going to use those cultural patterns and forms to present some real significant spiritual truth. This is a key missiological passage. I think it's interesting. Verse 24 and following. No, actually, let's start at, I'll read again, verse 22 through the end, because this whole idea of everyone runs a race, we speak on that topic a lot, right? That's a common passage. But think about it in light of its context. We don't usually talk about it in light of its context. I think we often give it a different interpretation. Verse 22, when I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I've tried to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. Don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. I run with purpose in every step. I am not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself be disciplined. What is the race that he's running in the context? Is that one of those obvious questions, and that's why nobody's answering?
The call to His calling in the Lord.
Okay, His calling in the Lord, His walk with God. I think that's how we tend to interpret it. Whatever God has given us to do, and we should do it in a way that we won't get caught up in sin and stumble and fall. All right, we discipline our bodies. We don't get caught up in all those other things. But in the context, is there a different interpretation here? Any thoughts?
It almost seems like a cultural race in them, because he talks about how it's like everyone's running a race, but you need to run to win. I don't know what that means exactly, or how.
Well, certainly he's part of this Greek world, and they had, athletic competitions and all that, so we do have some cultural background to unpack that. But is maybe the race that he's talking about running is winning people to Christ in different cultures. And disciplining my body is being disciplined to communicate according to those particular cultural patterns. And that would be taking this passage in context. We don't usually see it that way because we usually extract it from its context. And we apply some other meanings to it that are biblical, because we can go to other passages and get those other meanings. But I would suggest that even that part of the chapter is talking about the importance of missiologically, when we cross cultures, being very disciplined in communicating the gospel according to that cultural value. Using the cultural forms, disciplining ourselves so that when we try to do that in that culture, we win, we don't lose. And for centuries, people have crossed cultures and not been disciplined. We've just gone and done it the way we've always done it in our culture, and we didn't win. We saw a lot of failure. And so I think that there's a truth in there. All right, so human culture is a vehicle that God and his people use for Christian purposes rather than an enemy to be combated or shunned. That's one of the things that I think we can extrapolate, and that Kraft extrapolates from this passage. God's attitude toward culture is not, it's evil, avoid it, but no, use it. Get in there, use the forms, and communicate a higher truth through the culture. So there is sort of an attitude of God toward culture that we can pull out of this. The truth is that God is responsible for the presence of culture. God created human beings to be culture-producing beings. We produce culture. We are imprinted with culture, and then we modify it by our collective behaviors, and then we pass it on to the next generation. When you become a parent, you become a culture imprinter, and you don't even know it. As you are raising your child to be a good citizen, to be a good human being, you are imprinting your cultural values, the rules that they need to function well within the society, within the culture that they're going to be raised in. And so we are culture-producing beings. And without clearly defined and consistent guidelines for behavior, human beings experience psychological stress and dysfunction. We need culture, because if we don't have these guidelines of how we should behave, it creates stress. You can't function well without it. Otherwise, you don't know how to greet people, you don't know how to do squat. When someone dies, it's emotional enough to experience the loss of someone. We have cultural forms of funerals, how we're to function over the next 3 days, 4 days, to walk through this grieving process. And we have these rituals, and our rituals are different than other countries' rituals, and other cultures' rituals. But those rituals are very important to help us walk through a naturally very distressful and disturbing time in our life. We've got marriage rituals that help us walk through this covenant committing experience that we have. Okay, so God's attitude toward culture. There's a classic book, Richard Niebuhr's classic called Christ and Culture. He wrote it in 1951, and it's a classic because it lays out basically 3 basic positions, though in the book there's more like 4 or 5 positions, because the last one is divided up into several options. And they are Christ against culture, Christ in culture, and Christ above culture. How does God feel toward culture? How can we relate culture to God? And these are the three different ways that people have addressed that, and that Christians have addressed this topic. And so we'll take a look at each of those here this morning. First one is Christ against culture, or God against culture. And this equates the world with culture. And so let's look at 1 John 2, 15 and 16. 1 John 2. Daniel read last time. Andrew read last time. So who will read 1 John 2, 15 and 16? Now, what translation are you using?
ESV.
All right.
Change it.
No, you're good.
Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world.
Okay, and then let's flip to 5:19, same book. And would you read that one too?
We know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one.
Okay, so this there's the scriptures we just read, sees the essence of culture as the evil all around us, and the way to holiness is escaping from the world and is really condemning the world by, this is evil, and so we need to escape from the world around us. And I got ahead of myself. And since I'm choosing to get away from my desk. Okay. All right. So, and this is something we saw from the very beginning of Christianity. This kind of sense of an antagonism of early Christians toward, the Gentile Christians. We saw an antagonism toward Jewish culture in the early days of Christianity. We also saw an antagonism toward the Roman Greek culture. As the early Christians were persecuted, there was really a reaction against this Roman Greek culture and all the godlessness that was wrapped up in the Roman Greek world. Later on, when Christianity becomes the majority culture, with Constantine in the 300s, then we have the development of, in that time period, of the Desert Fathers. And so we have, again, this pulling away from the world and going out to the desert where we can be with God in a more pure way and not defiled by the culture around us. Then we fast forward to today, to our world. And we have expressions of this God against culture in Christianity today. What would be some examples of that?
Like the people who carry around the God hates signs. I don't know, that's the first thing that came to my head.
And those tend to be fundamentalists.
Fundamentalists.
Yeah. So fundamentalism really carries this God against the
all
world,
culture.
God against culture idea. I need to extract myself from it. And otherwise I'm defiled, I'm not holy. We also, I think we tend to see it in our Christian subculture that we've developed. Where we've got this isolationism and this bubble we've got our Christian stores, and we've got our Christian radio stations, and we got our Christian TV stations, and we're holy if that's what we listen to and watch, and we hang out with just Christians because I don't want to get defiled by the world around me. And so we see expressions of this in today as well. You have expressions of it if you go back to the Amish and the Mennonite, you know, the culture around them, all these, you know, the clothes people wear, those are expressions of evil, and technology is evil, so we can't have cars, etc. So all of that is God against culture kind of concepts. We see it fleshed out when missionaries have gone to other cultures and insisted on converts leaving their cultural practices, all of them behind. And you've got to separate yourself out from that, your own culture, to be a true Christian. We see it sometimes in when Christians have rejected certain socio-political systems, communism, that is inherently evil, and so you can't function, you know, in the 1950s if if you went to a communist meeting, that would just be, you know, culturally we look down on that, but you certainly couldn't be a good Christian to do that. Socialism, sometimes people are caught up in that with capitalism even. So identifying, and now we've kind of gotten involved in it as Christians with political parties, where one party is evil and the other one is not, which is a joke. So, all right. So, 3 fallacies in this Christ against culture. What do you see as the problems with this? If you could guess what the 3 fallacies are, what would you say? What are the errors? What are the problems with this perspective that God is against culture?
I think it's idolatry.
Why is it idolatry?
Because we're idolizing our own opinions and our own thoughts and our own ways of life, our own culture.
Yes. Which is a failure to recognize that culture is not just something out there that I can withdraw from, but culture is internal. Mm-hmm. And so when I try to extract myself from culture, I take my own culture with me. Mm-hmm. And you're right, then I idolize my particular way of doing things as the right way. Okay? What else? 1 John 2:15 and 16. Don't love the world or anything in the world. Doesn't that sound like Christ against culture?
But isn't and God gives us 2 commandments, and it's love Him and love people, so
yeah.
Why would we hate the world? Hate what's in it, but not the people.
So the people we don't hate, but the world we do?
I know, the sin. The sin we hate.
The sin. And so, is sin and culture the same?
No.
No, they're not. That's the fallacy, is equating the word culture with the word world. Those are not the same thing. The world is using culture in a sinful way. We can use culture in a godly way, or we can use culture in a worldly way. That's the difference. So that's the first fallacy of equating culture with only the negative use of the word of the world in the New Testament. So we use culture, we just use it for good, not for evil. Number 2, assuming culture is only an external thing. That's what we already talked about. We can't just run away from it. We can't just escape from it. No, we function in culture. It's internalized as well as external. And so when we run away from it, we're taking it with us and we don't even realize it. And then number 3, assuming that all culture is evil. Just because Satan can use culture for evil doesn't mean culture itself is evil. Paul talks about in Romans 14:14, he talks about eating meat is not wrong. But if it's offered to idols and it's being dedicated to idols, eating that kind of meat with that knowledge that this has been offered to idols, and therefore it becomes an act of worship of idols, now that would be wrong. Okay, God's true attitude. Oh, there's something there tonight. The dilemma. Since we cannot escape culture, they unconsciously carry it with them, living by it, though believing they are free from it. Funny statement. Okay. God's true attitude toward culture is, and this is Kraft saying, God seeks to cooperate with human beings in the use of their culture for his glory. It is allegiance to the satanic use of the same culture that he stands against, not culture.